Mr. Boatin, what lured your father and you to Detroit?
Well, life in Pennsylvania, in Newcastle, wasn't very rosy. Having left, my father having left positions of leadership, both in the political and employment movement in Italy, my father was really a refugee from fascism after having been beaten up, given castor oil, machine oil. After 6-7 months of hiding, passage was provided. And as it was, he traveled to 3 different seaports, Genoa, Naples, and Palermo, before he finally was able to board a French ship on a French passport. So leaving Italy was a heartbreaking proposition, but the real heartbreak came when we found anti-Catholic, my father was not Catholic, but he came from Italy, therefore, no employment, no jobs available, the feeling prevalent that the corporations preferred to hire a foreigner because he would work harder and for less money. So life was not very good. And they had very strict sky blue laws, blue sky laws. And my father, who had been an activist and a labor guy, was fired from Carnegie Steel Mill, where he'd worked in a 3 floors up. I remember looking at his shoes. His shoes had 3 soles as a means of deflecting the heat that came through these grills. They weren't solid floors, they were grills, you see. He was fired from there, and my uncle recommended him for a job in a cement mine. And he convinced, most of the workers were Italian, he convinced them that they should have a union. So my father was fired from there, and my uncle, who was conservative, was also fired. Then came the news of where they go, and the news was that Detroit was hiring people. So it was natural to come to Detroit and to try to find a job with Ford. And above all, my father liked the idea of being associated with Ford. I particularly liked the idea. I didn't know that eventually I would try to get a job there. But Ford was being denounced for having introduced the 8-hour day, $5 a day for the first 6 months, $6 after that. You eat 15-minute lunch on company time. And this was destructive of capitalism. He was called an anarchist. He was called all types of things. People even dug up the fact that during the First World War, Ford had talked about peace in the world. And I even built a ship and sent it to Europe. But they didn't know that ship had brought back a lot of Polish workers because they couldn't speak English and because they were big and strong and had hard backs. He thought he could get more work out of them than... But life in Detroit was attractive in terms of employment, but there were no jobs to be had immediately. Months passed before employment was secured.
Also, sir, could you look at me whenever you can, just sort of glance up at me when you talk, so we can make eye contact with it.
Right.
Can you describe what it was like for people coming to Detroit, what it would look like? And I'm referring to the parking lot experience. Where were you standing?
Well, my uncle and father came here first. I was left back with my aunts, my uncle's family, who had 2 children in Newcastle, and we would come to Detroit eventually, but I mean, I would have responsibility for the furniture and for moving and so forth. So when we came here, my uncle and father had already found a home, and they had already gathered some information as to where to go for employment and so forth. Neither one of them had a job. They came here in May The family didn't come until later. We were within a 2-mile walking distance of the Ford Rouge plant, and we explored the area where the employment office, and saw that in order to stand a chance of being interviewed for a job at the employment office, you would have to come there in the middle of the night, because there were already thousands of people gathered there. Eventually, that number became millions for a period of 25 to 26, according to the publicity I saw during that period. People had come to secure employment, even though the company wasn't going to hire all of them. The desperation was such that people came. Variety of accents, variety of faces, variety of appearances. Some poor illiterate workers would come from the South. Those Southerners, Southern whites who were not illiterate, eventually became foremen. My foreman, when I got a job later, was a Southern white who stood over me with a 3x5 card. But the presence of thousands and thousands of people, all seeking employment, was, I think, taught everybody a very interesting lesson. And the experience, the few things that I learned, some of the advice that I got, even though I consider myself sophisticated, I eventually discovered that a lot of these ordinary people who had no pretense and no expectation and no glorified ideas, who made no pretense of having a particular knowledge, of having, some admitted that they hadn't gone to school. They knew more from the school of life than I knew, even though I had read many books. I was bilingual a little by that time. I even studied English somewhat. Those were lessons that I know laid the foundation for some of the resentment that developed over the years against the Ford Motor Company. Because they stood in the parking lot day and night, not even water to drink, no facilities. There were no trees, the sun shining down on you, and some cooperation developed. Workers standing there developed some sort of fraternal way of assisting each other. If one went away, he would make sure that the person next to him would hold his place for him. So there was the beginning of associated cooperative activity, which came in handy later on. It was a learning experience.
Can you describe the transformation of the sociological department to the service department? What was it like to work in the Ford plant?
The conditions that prevail there have been pictured, some in song, some in vituperation. I said before that people learned a great deal, that there was resentment against Ford. But I also recall visiting the home of a Southern white worker. It seemed to me we were going to hold a picnic, and we stopped there for information on Telegraph Road, outside of Detroit. And from where I stood in his little living room, at an angle I could see the bedroom. And I've never been religious, but I knew that a lot of people would have a religious picture over the bed. And I was astonished to see a picture of Henry Ford, where a crucifix probably had stood later, according to the wallpaper. Picture of Ford hung over the the bridal bed. Maybe that answers your question as to the type of mentality that prevailed and the type of kind of fear, kind of self-protective display of Fordism in the form of Henry Ford's picture. The paper always talked about later on about what a great industrial and a great man Henry Ford was.
Can you describe what the fear in the factory?
Well, as even though Ford had advertised the 8-hour day, three shifts per day, all of that, the work was not continuous. When a new model came out in the month of July and August, they rushed production, and by January and February of the following model year, they had produced cars for 6, 7, 8 continuous months. There were layoffs. So people resorted to all types of personal strategy. If you were an Italian, you brought wine to the foreman.
Okay, hold on one second. We ran out of film. We have to reload. What was it like in the reality of life in the plants when you were working there? What was it like to have the service department over you?
Well, my own personal experience for the first 16 or 18 months before I got fired the first time was concerned with the fact that I had come to Detroit to work for Mr. Ford, and I would not lie to Mr. Ford and tell him I was only 16 and 2 months old. And they only gave me half pay, and during the entire 18 months, they would never change the damn thing. So I was personally indignant. But I began to have a feeling of the thing that was described by Charlie Chaplin later in City Lights, that we were cogs. Silence was demanded of everybody. No talking. We were being watched every minute. I became aware early that the Ford Motor Company was presented as being very generous. It hired a lot of deaf mutes. So much so that I became an interpreter for the deaf mutes in front of the employment office at a later date. But it was clear these deaf mutes were no dummies. Ford hired them, and the deaf mutes knew it, because they had agile fingers, they couldn't talk, all they knew was work, work, work. And I recall having a foreman over me whose language I couldn't understand. He spoke with a strong dialect, which I later learned was from the southern United States. But he always had a white 3x5 card and a little stubby pencil in his hand. And he always agitated you about what the other shift had done, how much production they turned out, and that his job was in danger because we weren't doing as much work as the people on the other shift. And he had to protect himself. The Ford sociological department visited people at their homes. They wanted to know, they pretended to be working for the welfare of the family. So they wanted to make sure that you went to church, that you didn't drink, that you believed in monogamy, all those things, you were faithful. Essentially, though, this was not just part of a conservative belief that Henry Ford and his operators used, but they wanted obedient people. And the more ignorant, the less you knew in a mass production industry, the more work you did. and the more dependable. You were not dangerous. And they used, but in addition, of course, during periods of layoff, they had more terrible measures. Instead of being laid off, you'd be kept on a job if you did the right thing. Even including having supervisors, many of them, at your house for sumptuous dinners. Italian food was always famous, and all Italians made home wine at that time, even in violation of prohibition laws. They were allowed to make 300 barrels of Italian wine. And I don't know personally of any cases where a foreman was permitted to sleep with a worker's wife, but there were stories out in circulation about that as well. And we had learned to know because a lot of the workers were Italian, and particularly the guys on Bennett's staff were Italians. And as soon as the union was organized later, most of those guys vamoosed because they were afraid of the lie.
Okay, that's good. You did it. Tell me about these ideas.
There were books. There were advertisements. I remember advertisements. I responded to some of them. That if you had $2,000 to invest, that money would multiply very fast if you had the right type of advice. So in 1927, I was only 18 years old. I attended a couple of seminars where people got up and said, yes, this is how I got rich. This is how I did this. I started with nothing. Those tactics were not new. They were new to me. Besides, I was looking for a place where to fit. I had gone to school. I attended I was put in the first grade in Pennsylvania 6 weeks after I arrived in Newcastle. I stayed in the first grade for 4 or 5 months, and then I moved up to 6th or 7th grade, I forget. Then I began to teach other people how to speak English, because there were a lot of Italians arriving there. So I considered myself capable of going beyond the experience that my dad had working for Carnegie. I did not know about Carnegie's fame at that time. I only knew what the hell that steel mill looked like. And I remember what my father's work had been in Italy. So I believed I succumbed to some of the propaganda. And there were 3 newspapers in the Detroit area, all singing the same tune. If you were unpatriotic, if you found anything critical to say, you're certainly stupid, besides being unpatriotic, if you didn't take advantage of some of the opportunities. Hence, I went to some of the seminars. And in the meantime, I picked up odd jobs after I'd been fired for Ford's. And eventually, as part of this development of getting rich, I became a contractor. At age 18, I had 4 adult people working for me, because in the meantime, my father had signed me up at the Wolverine School of Trades for $368. And I was on top of the world. I thought, that propaganda existed at the school. All you have to do is pay attention, blah, blah, blah. And I stayed that way with hesitation and uncertainty, but I didn't learn my final lesson until 1929, when the crash came. And I didn't know what caused the crash necessarily, but I learned enough from the couple of years of experience from 27 to 29 to know that I had succumbed to a lot of bamboozled ideas that really weren't realistic. But I also knew this, that soon after the crash of 1929, some people who had not been very rich, a little neighborhood bank, the People's State Bank in Oakwood, began to repossess houses. And there were people who actually became very, very rich from the Depression of 1929. Repossessed homes. There was no law preventing repossession. And there was something very, very educational about that experience.
We only have, tell me what tell me what the ideas were, point blank. Tell me what those ideas were that you had.
Well, I indicated that even upon being fired and mistreated unjustly at Ford's and being, for being honest and having thought of Ford as Mr. Ford, that I blamed myself, that there was something wrong with with what had happened to me, and that means that I hadn't learned the bitter experience of.
Okay, cut for a second. Just tell me what you believed. Hold on, he's still slating. Right there. Okay.
I attended several promotional meetings. In some of them, you even had to pay admission because I thought that was the way to wealth and certainly some success. So I believed in the story of this is where you can make it, boy. If you know the right people and you do the right thing, you can make it. Never mind that you got fired. Never mind that you still think of some of your father's life in Italy as longingly. This is where you are. And correct your ways. You'll make it. I really accepted that, hook, line, and sinker. I'm sure of that, as I think back.
Okay, that's great. Cut. I think you came just slightly afterward, right?
Yes.
But you drove a wounded person.
Yes.
I wonder if you could recall what your feelings were and what you saw at that point in time. Can you relate that experience to me? Just that moment when you came across this scene, how it made you feel.
Well, I knew I was in Cleveland, and I knew from literature that I had seen and sort of recruiting that had occurred, that there was going to be a march on Miller Road in response to the Ford Motor Company saying, anybody wants a job? There's lots of jobs, And there also had been statements made by the Dearborn Police Department, which had always been on the side of Ford Motor Company, that the march would not be permitted. The people assembled anyway and marched down Miller Road till they got to the gates of the Ford Motor Company. The property of the Ford Motor Company on both sides of Miller Road commence at Dix Avenue. Dearborn police were there, sort of barricaded, but the workers pushed through. Now, many suspected that the reason why the police were eventually permitted the march to go through, because they knew that a trap was being laid about a mile and a half further down. But I wasn't present. I got there a little late. When I left, one of the things that was left from my experience as a little capitalist, a contractor, was a Model T 1927 Ford car. I jumped into the car. I knew I was late. And one of my brothers said, where are you going? Where are you going? And I dashed over. I just saw the smoke. Miller Road was covered with smoke from shooting and from tear gas. And there was a wounded person laying to one side at the corner of Dix and Miller. And I understood some arrangements had been made, a little preparatory to contingencies of this type, to take wounded people to the hospital. And I took them to Delray Hospital in West Jefferson, which no longer exists, but which performed some important services. It was manned by, it was a Hungarian neighborhood, the friendly territory. And I returned to the scene to find that 4 people were dead. one whom I had known, Joe de Blasio, and that a fifth person was wounded. And people were scattering and running in all types of directions because it was dangerous, dangerous territory.
How do you feel?
Well, by this time, I was reliving the period of fascism in Italy after the march on Rome of 1922 by Mussolini, by the fascists. And I hadn't really, in spite of the fact that I had gone through the experience of thinking that I fitted in, and I didn't hesitate telling people that I had been a contractor, you know, a lot of failure. I guess that's what I wanted to say. But the ground under my feet was not secure, and I had long stopped calling Ford Mr. Ford. And but the agitation was continuous prior to the march and after the march against outside agitators, against communist troublemakers and so forth. And it was not easy to become completely indignant at what had happened because you lived with fear. You were learning very fast that in many, many ways, this was far from being the free country that you had heard about, that you hoped it would be. That there was anti-foreign feeling, to say nothing of anti-black feeling. The blacks were, but it was a learning experience. A learning experience. And while it would be, I think, misleading to imagine that everybody in Detroit learned, that all the workers learned, because they didn't. They didn't. We met in basements, one or two at a time. Wayne County Prosecutor Toy, T-O-Y, never forget that name, funny name for a prosecutor, kept agitating that he knew who the culprits were and that an imminent arrest was going to occur. While you were learning, you were also afraid. I was afraid. I was no better than anybody else. But
Wait, speed. Tell me what you experienced in Grand Circus Park, please.
well, for several months after the 1929 crash, you could feel a lot of desperation in the air. Those who by January or February of 1930 were contacted by banks to buy off 10 cents on a dollar contracts on homes that had been repossessed. They didn't tell us about what they were doing. They were satisfied. You would read periodically about some banker that jumped out of a window. But generally, I think that everybody was unprepared for what had happened. They had absorbed and accepted the propaganda about getting rich in 27, 28, and up to October 29. They were totally unprepared. Unfortunately, we had a president who Some have accused of being insensitive or ignorant. I don't think he was either insensitive or ignorant. He had become world famous by having fed or fought the famine in Russia in 1919, 20, and 21. Certainly he should have known something about how to take care of the American multitudes that were affected by the Depression. So instead of taking care of people, we were told that the Depression was over, prosperity was around the corner, and the car in every garage, the chicken in every pot. That was really the propaganda. I would say that analysts will determine at a later date that there was such a fear of revolution in this country that the only way they could combat it was by circulating this type of lie. Prosperity is coming. Don't worry, buddy. Everything is going to be all right. But people were going through experience of their own. I think everybody was learning, the young people particularly. Those that had worked in industry thought, oh, well, I'll get back. They had a couple of dollars saved. But the 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old people, they were up all night. They had more energy to spend. They were looking for answers, maybe. And for 5 cents a day, you could live at a penny cafeteria on Woodward Avenue near Grand Circus Park, and that became a concentration point. Also because there were speeches there. There were guys who tried to give you answers. All the grass in Grand Circus Park, the most beautiful park Detroit had, was trampled. The bushes were trampled. There was nothing left there from the constant assemblies. People lived on the park benches, slept on the floor on newspapers. And it became a school of ideas, a school of ideas. Possibly Detroit was a little lucky that we had a mayor who might have been a little bit better than the average person, but he was not a big city man. He had come from a small town in the thumb and had a farm mentality that reflected some of the same charges about foreign agitators and so forth and so on. And the city was being paid with scrip. Workers were being laid off. Racism crept in. Anti-foreign sentiment crept in. True Americans were permitted.
Right there.
People were left all alone.
Tom, just say what you just said.
If you'll just sit back a little bit.
Tell me what the learning experience was.
Grand Circus Park. That was a university of economic and political ideas, raw. Mostly, the people who stayed there day and night had no families. They were young, unmarried, lost, no roots. But they were looking for answers much more so than adults. But there really wasn't anybody there to supply the answers. These young people knew that Hoover wasn't supplying the answer. Newspaper editors weren't supplying the answers. The mayor didn't come there to speak. And since the assemblage was peaceful, there really wasn't anybody that interfered with the people. So they felt at home, and Grand Circus Park, in addition to being a place where to learn, try to find answers, was also comfortable. They didn't feel so lost by being there. But when a speaker came, and it was usually a communist, who had a program, there was great response. And then there came a day when people weren't just satisfied to listen to a speaker. They became a little rebellious. They began to make demands. They were translating what they were hearing and the ideas that they had digested that were maturing in their brains into demands for action. Well, action didn't come very fast. Later on, civilian conservation corps to isolate the young people for the purpose of teaching them a trade came. But during the early period, nothing. No soup lines, no speeches, no direction. The young people felt deserted, except the communists, the few radical agitators that came. And people were becoming impatient, but the learning experience was also giving them strength and courage and greater understanding. And those are memorable days.
Well, also, could you look at me? What did they find out in Grand Circus Park?
I am not sure that everybody found out the same things that I found. Either prior to that or shortly after I joined the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, which had a glorious record in out west primarily. I had learned about Joe Hill and some of his songs. I knew that Joe Hill had been executed by a firing squad in the trumped-up charges in 1915.
Excuse me, hold cut. You know what I'm driving at, right?
Sure.
So if you had a job at this period of time, working for Ford, 1931, 32, what did it mean?
I only know two people, and they were going to be participants in this if conditions that permitted, who admit being in a plant in 1932. One had a key job in a powerhouse, so he doesn't mind admitting that he didn't really want to be there, but after all, without him.
Wait a second, we have a big sound.
It's gone now.
Okay.
So he was working in a powerhouse, and he justifies that.
Could you start at the beginning?
Just wait a minute, it's not done.
Okay, we're gonna cut for a second, because what did it mean to have a job in the Ford plant in 1931, 32?
Well, basically, I would have to say that the general opinion has been and continues to be that if you were not laid off and you continue to work in 32, 33, 34, in 35 things became a little better, in 36 better still. But those first 2.5 years after the Depression, if you continue to work, you had to be an ascusser. You had to be a person who played ball with the foreman, with wine and food, and you went to the boss's house and painted it on weekends, grew his garden, did all kinds of things. You were on the side of the company therefore kept you subservient by letting you work in exchange for services of various types that you provided. You were a company guy, with rare exceptions.
Okay. I wondered if you could talk about, could you characterize those years for me, 1930, 31, 32?
I forget now exactly when the Veterans March to Washington took place. I'm not completely clear about some events in the last half of 1930 in Detroit and the first half of 1931 because I was away for a time. But I periodically returned, and I had become a subscriber to various newspapers, and I had attended meetings of unemployed in Chicago And in Detroit, prior to leaving here, and I had been a member of the unemployed councils and the unemployed workers alliance. And I had become disillusioned with what I had hoped the IWW, with the answers that they would supply. I personally was somewhat lost, and I was looking for answers. It was then that I began to associate with some communists, and I joined a cultural youth group, the youth division of the Workmen's Circle. There were girls there too, of course. But I was looking for social contact. I wanted to get away from being lost because I had the feeling that the answers had not been given to the young people. The young people were lost. What kind of loss was it? I am not sure. Where was America going? The presidency, the President of the United States did not supply any of the answers. The papers were negative. They were scared stiff that the people would rebel or would look for answers elsewhere. So there really was a terrible feeling of hopelessness, as though all hope, all past dreams, all visions of greatness and of success had been artificial. Everything had, and I suppose that was one of the reasons why I went searching for answers elsewhere. That's why I wound up in Chicago. That's why I thought a gold mine in Wyoming, my brother Mackenzie, who had been a revolutionary in Ireland, fighting for Irish independence. New experiences. But it was really running away from the situation of despair, I think, that one found in the big cities. What'd you do? You went to a farmer and he gave you a sack of carrots. You exchanged labor with that farmer in exchange for the carrots. Some farmers may have been a little illuminating, but generally they were close to the soil. And they weren't thinking about the changing conditions too much. They just wanted to get enough seed or enough money for seed for the following year. There were no answers. There were no answers. The only people that supplied answers were some communist agitators and speakers who spoke eloquently, but they tied their solutions with what had happened in Russia in the revolution, and it seemed remote. People weren't ready to accept. In any event, basically, the famous unemployed councils and the Workers' Alliance, what were they? What did they do? They were dealing with immediate basic demands. If you were evicted from a house, the Workers' Alliance would come and put your furniture back. The next day, the furniture would be out on the streets. You went there and put it back, and you got clubbed and got arrested. Nobody was really dealing with basic solutions. As I think of it now, it was despair. Despair.
You said, when I think back on it now, you better change the focal length too. When you think back, what was the feeling?
When I think back at the many days and nights spent on Grand Circus Park, occasionally a speaker would invigorate us. There were moments of hope. But speeches do not produce solutions. Despair alone does not produce solutions. And there was a period about the middle of 1930 where the numbers of people in the park began to diminish. And as a matter of fact, I now recall another sad aspect. On Michigan Avenue at 3rd, 4th, and 5th Streets, not far away from the famous Buck Cadillac Hotel, the city had permitted all those empty stores to be turned into home-produced beer joints. People actually got licenses. Every store made beer, home brew, so that with empty stomachs, from 11 o'clock on, you invariably found not so much the young people, but some of the older people that had assembled in Grand Circus Park, slouched on the sidewalk in front of these joints with an empty bottle of home brew. It was sad because while I hadn't myself had too much confidence in the government providing solutions, I was part of my disappointment with the then Mayor Frank Murphy, was based on the fact that that sort of thing was permitted as an escape. And that contributed to the despair that took over. And it was really, it was a hopeless, desperate situation which showed no signs of any hope or solution. It was really, despair took over is the best way to describe it.